Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, presented at the Arlington Heights Memorial Library. I'm Neil. I work in the Programs and Exhibits department here at the library, and we're absolutely thrilled to have you here for this enlightening exploration into the intersection of faith and food in American history. Our guest this evening is Christina Ward, an editor, author, and I should have led with an author and editor, and the vice president of Feral House Publishing. Christina's latest book, Holy Food: How Cults, Communes, and Religious Movements Influence What We Eat in American History, delves into the surprising ways religious beliefs have shaped American cuisine. From the dietary laws of kosher and halal to the communal meals of the Oneida community, Christina uncovers how food has been used to control, entice, and even revolutionize followers. Again, just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and I want to thank you, Christina. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to you. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for inviting me, Neil. I love talking about food as much as I like eating food. So thank you so much for everyone joining us here virtually. I'm joining you from not too far away, outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in Cudahy, where it is also raining. So we'll get through this lovely evening indoors together. And if you're joining us from other places in the country, just imagine you're in the Midwest under tornado watches. As you can see, we're going to talk about holy food. And is it a dry subject? No, it's not. It's actually quite, I think, interesting. And I wrote the book because I think people got tired of me talking about it every time somebody picked up a package of Little Debbie's. Then I would be like, do you know where these come from? So instead of bothering everybody, we wrote a book and hopefully it's less bothersome. So where do we start? We start in the beginning. And of course, that's Charlton Heston and not actually Moses. Um, but we start at the beginning because to understand the influence of the cults and the communes and new religious movements, we have to go back and understand a little bit more of kind of the modern religious belief system, which is what often called like the Abrahamic religions that are all related to each other. So Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all have some shared overlap in the both the prophets re, respect, as well as some of the food rules. And so some of the earliest food rules that we usually understand are the kashrut, what's kosher. And what's really interesting is if you look at a lot of the kosher food rules about don't eat scavengers, don't eat pork. Well, people would say, why pork? And you'll hear often it's a filthy animal. Not because it likes mud, they're talking about internally, the meat is full of pathogens that will make you sick. And this is just a very old illustration to show you that people were very concerned from the earliest days to even now about the purity and the quality of their food. It would be quite easy to be poisoned, whether accidentally or, sadly, sometimes on purpose. And so food becomes very important, not just to keeping us alive, but it also becomes an important part of ritual. And so when we think about what is clean and what's unclean, because now we're sharing food, we're in a group together, whether it's families or tribes, we are all together. And eating a meal together is one of the first acts of trust. I trust that you're not going to poison me. You trust that I am not going to make you sick. And so all of these early food rules, as you can see on this screen, that shows you a difference between the British Israelite version of the kosher rules and then also haram, which means essentially the forbidden foods from Islam. And there is, again, a lot of overlap. These rules come about, again, if you follow them, you'd actually have a really like safe, a very pathogen safe food supply. So we go through that and you're like, okay, so the food rules act as a way to keep our people healthy, first of all. And it also starts to become an identifier. And are you a people that eat pork? No, we're not. And so we recognize that. Maybe we don't eat meat at all. Maybe we only eat certain kinds. So, when you start developing rules about your community, your belief, it starts helping shape that belief. And of course, in the Eastern traditions of what's called, and this is an Anglo word, this is not a traditionally like Urdu or Sanskrit word of called um, Prasadam and Hinduism. In Hinduism, which is Indian subcontinent and throughout, of the idea of sharing different gods, and the gods also have very specific tastes, and they're all food related. And so prasadam itself means holy food. And what you see at the bottom is Papa Radha, who is the founder of the Hare Krishnas. And in a very simple practice, with the Hare Krishnas who revered the god Krishna, who is, as above, depicted as a very hungry, naughty little boy with a sweet tooth. And so a lot of the foods that they offer to Krishna, their god, are foods that they would like, that they hope the god likes. And that is one of the practices, is by offering the food to a god, it becomes holy. And by then consuming it, then you too are sanctified. And that may sound familiar to a few people. If you recently, we were just passing over the Christian Eastern time, Eastern traditions, and you may recognize some of these ideas of offering the blessing and getting a blessing and saying blessings before you eat. So these are old traditions that are made true. But again, even as old as these traditions are, they still are exist in our modern world. So this is actually one of my favorite advertisements. So it still shows Krishna as the very naughty, hungry little boy, but again, it's an advertisement for pizza. So it doesn't matter. As modern people, we are always thinking about the ways we can share our food, advertise our food, and get other people to eat the food we want them to eat. And the second element from the ancients that we need to kind of think about are the notions of feasting and fasting. And of course, the two images here showing the extremes of that. You've got the bacchanal of the feast on one side, and then the image of the emaciated monk, who technically that is one of the Buddhist monks who famously meditated and fasted themselves into a transition. They don't think of them as dead. They say that that's actually the encased body, mummified body of that particular Buddhist saint who, again, fasted. If we think about what fasting does too, just to the body, fasting, it can, if you go for a longer period of time without food, you will start to hallucinate. You will start to have visions. And so that's something that to keep in mind, especially when we talk about some of these very early stories of seers, prophets, saints, and religious people who often are led to a revelation through fasting. So we have fasting and we give that up to God, we of our choice. We fast when we're looking to atone for something. We're fasting to see a purification of the body and soul as a way to get wisdom. And then for feasting, we feast to celebrate. We celebrate our good luck, our good bounty, God's love, God's bounty again. So it's the idea of these extremes, and that we believe that all the food comes from God. And when we don't honor our gods enough, we get punished by having the food taken away. I'm going to move very fast ahead in time. We're not going to go and hit every single like element of religious belief, but I am touching on some of the ones that when we get to later, when we get to the United States, become really important. This is a very silly illustration of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a scientist. And in the 1600s, though, science often encompassed what we would think of as kind of metaphysical, a lot of religious belief, because again, what we know, scientifically know of the world was unknown at that time. Swedenborg is important to note here because he's one of the first people to identify electrical particles. This notion that everything is made up of some sort of energy unit. That was him. Well, that part's true, but he also extrapolated that out to think that all spiritual matter is electrical. And because it's electrical, we can then communicate with other planes. And so the Swedenborgians actually developed themselves as their own religion. But they're one of the first instances where they're looking at this idea of trying to scientifically prove God's existence and trying to scientifically talk to God and have God talk back to you in a way that can be quantified. And so that's an important element that when we get to the United States, I'm going to pause here. And this is also an important thing to talk about. So we're going to talk about cults and new religious movements and all of that stuff. And the first question always comes up is, what is a cult? Is it a cult? There's a way to tell, is it a cult? A cult is something usually considered high control. And what is high control? That they're controlling your behavior, they control your information, the information that you receive. So if you're in a group that limits what television programs you can watch or what newspapers you can read, that is a high control group and they're controlling the information you consume. Thought, a group that controls thought. There's psychological coercion going on that it's the don't believe your lying eyes. So cults exercise a high amount of control over what people think. And then again, they also have a large amount of control over what people feel and will look to be very emotionally coercive. So those are the elements that make a cult a cult. Now, a group that you are a member of may have one or two elements of it. That doesn't necessarily make it a cult. For example, your bowling team all has matching shirts. Well, that's a way of controlling your behavior, but that doesn't make it a cult. But if your bowling ball is talking to you and telling you to do things, and that's your God, and now all of a sudden you worship that and you don't let other bowling balls join your bowling league, well, now you're moving into cultic territory. So knowing that, we can go back and think about America. And as we are founded, these immigrant cultures coming over to settle the native indigenous land, which is to say, of course, indigenous people having their own belief systems. And the earliest settlers coming to the United States were religious fundamentalists. If we think about our First Amendment in the United States, it's a really important thing. Even in the pre-First Amendment days, say in the 1600s, 1700s, um, there was no notion of a state-controlled religion. Even today, in most countries, especially in European countries, there is a state religion, and the country will still ban certain religions. For example, it's illegal in Russia to be a Jehovah's Witness. Scientology is illegal in Germany. In the United States to this day, and from its earliest just colonial days, is there was no prohibition. There was no state religion. You could believe whatever the heck you wanted to. And for many of the European countries, they were not prepared, nor were they willing to deal with these groups, these new believers who had these ideas that were contrary to like official teachings in these churches. They did not want them rabble rousing because that would have been it. They would have been having control over a group of people who could then rise up against the feudal lord, would offer political challenge to a local leader. And so it started, they came over here. So when we think about American history, the Pilgrims famously are Puritans. They're very highly fundamentalist Protestants, very Calvinistic, meaning very rigid in their beliefs. The other groups that people may be familiar with in the term of Amish, those are Anabaptists who in the central German areas were causing a lot of problems by going against the local princes. They came over too. So you've got all these groups of people with divergent religious beliefs coming to the United States to establish themselves. And this is where we start seeing the first American communes out of new religious movements. These are two images. The one of the picture of the ladies, the Economites, they are German in origin, and they are an Anabaptist group, so akin to Hutterites or Amish, and they believed in communal living and they believed in working together. And one of their biggest economic sustainers was wine. They were great winemakers. And these particular people didn't have a prohibition against alcohol and made it and sold it. And a lot of early American new religious movements were winemakers. So again, all this influence on the food, we don't always know. The other picture, which is the very dour looking people in the lithograph, is the Amana colony, the Amana folks. Amana, Iowa, which is now a National Historic Site, was a very odd fundamentalist Christian German group. They believed that the Lord spoke through one person that was appointed, and it could be a man, it could be a woman, and that person was the rule maker. And so it could shift what their practices were based on who was in charge. Um, for the majority of their lifespan, and they are considered a pretty successful group, is they separated the sexes. Men and women for a long time couldn't live together. They didn't eat together. And they didn't share kitchens. And most families lived in, when you had a family, there was only like bedrooms, and that was it. They had something called a cook base, which was the communal kitchens. And out of that, they've got a practice of this very kind of what's called plain food. And you'll see from these very earliest of these fundamentalist groups was that German influence on the food. And so when we think about meat, potatoes, that kind of stodgy stuff, that comes from those German immigrants coming over with their religious beliefs and bringing their food with them. So we come now officially, we are a country, and reminding everybody, because I'd mentioned the First Amendment, and that is this clause, the Establishment Clause of shall make no law establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free expression thereof, and all of it. That is such a key thing because you don't have the new religious movements and the explosion of different religious ideas anywhere but in the United States. It could only happen here because here is where it was okay for God to talk to you and for you to talk to God and for you to say, God told me, and I'm going to tell everybody else. This particular image you're seeing is another element that is rife in all of the American new religious movements and cults. And this is the notion of the lost tribes of Israel. So if we go back to our biblical history, there's, so many tribes, and there was a belief that there was a lost tribe. And starting in the 1200s, and then but it really took root in the 1600s, this notion that the lost tribes might actually be British. And that is a notion that still to this day, there are groups that believe this, that they don't come publicly and talk about it, but in their founding documents, if you kind of get to closer to the hierarchies, you'll find out that they are believers, that they are truly the descendants of Abraham, and that they are the true Jews. And the people who've been practicing Judaism along that tradition, they are the fake Jews. They are not real. It's the British that are real. And this, of course, then came to the United States. And this is one of the kind of propaganda posters of the time to help convince people that this was it. Now, in case you're thinking that this was just like a really niche kind of belief, oh no, millions and millions and millions of people. I mean, talking, 15 million people in England at the time, and a commensurate amount in the United States were all signed on to say yes. And then you may be asking, well, what groups believe that? Church of Latter-day Saints, is Assemblies of God, of all things. They are all rooted in this notion of lost tribes. So knowing that, we come to explosion of religiosity in the United States that leads to all of our food stuff, which is often referred to as the Great Awakening. And this is in the mid 1800s, so about 1820s, 30s, 40s, it really starts. And it all happens in the same place in upstate New York. And called to this day the burnt over area. And really what happens is that some itinerant preachers are coming through and people are responding and realizing that there could be a different way to believe. And so you see a couple of the pictures here, I'll point them out. The very dour man in the corner is William Miller, and on the opposite side is Miller's chart for calculating the end of the world. That's my note to anyone who is a wannabe prophet. Do not predict a date to the end of the world. Keep that open and vague, because when that date passes, you'll have what Mr. Miller had, which was called the Great Disappointment. But why we need to talk about Miller is that he was very charismatic, very popular. The advent of the cheap paper and printing presses, that little flyer you see was disseminated throughout the world. Again, millions and millions of people saw this calculation. And out of the ruins of Miller's work and the Great Disappointment was born the Seventh-day Adventists. The man sitting on the bottom of the screen is Joseph Smith, who again is the founder of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And he too had a revelation. Oh, that's another tip. If you're looking to have a revelation, they always seem to happen in a shady grove in the forest. So find yourself a good looking tree and, see what God has to say to you. The ladies in the upper center picture are the Fox sisters. Again, same time period, in New York. And they were the first spiritualists. They were famous for like what they called like the knocking, the table knocking, and the spirits kind of making noises and communicating and channeling. And so this is the stew that all of this is cooking, all of these ideas spreading around via paper, via itinerant preachers, books. And so it's suffice to say, the United States is on fire with religious belief, and it started spreading. And so we talk about some of the earliest of these religious communes and utopian communes, and then there's an overlap. This idea of utopia that you can just work together and build the perfect place. And a lot of them have that religious component. From the map you see, it makes it over to the Midwest, and we see a lot of the Mormons, the Shakers, again, and the Quakers. All of these are new religious movements. The the Owenites, which were a secular group, but they were still had they didn't believe in God per se, but they believed in socialism, but they still built communes and had some pretty out there ideas. And the same with the Fourerites, there was a crossover. So this is out of the time period. This map, which is not showing the date, is from about 1860, right pre-Civil War. Is you're seeing all of this stuff. And we think about anybody who's read Little Women. Louisa May Alcott grew up on Brook Farm, which was a commune started um, by her father's friend, and then they started their own called Fruitlands, which was an abject failure. But I want to stress that this was not out of the ordinary. They were all over the place, these ideas of these communes and these new religious movements. People were very open to new ideas. This is an example of one of the Owenite, Fourite commune buildings. It's called a phalanx, and there's still one up there in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. You can go see. And there's a few, I think there's one left in New Jersey. But you can see these were built for communal living, and there were no like shared rooms really. There's very open. And so I always put this one on. This is like from, again, right, it's right on the border between Wisconsin and Illinois. Is even these new religious movements had schisms within it. And that's part of what makes it interesting when we get to the food is so James Strang, pictured here, he had a falling out with Joseph Smith. Even before, this is far before Nauvoo and far before the big Great Migration to Utah. The renegade Mormon settled in Burlington and called the Strangites. The Strangites are a fun footnote. There's a great book by Miles Harvey, a Chicagoan, about James Strang, and I recommend everybody read it because after the new religious movement stuff didn't work out for him, he took over Beaver Island in Lake Michigan and became a Great Lakes pirate. So that little asterisk of all these new religious movements start going just bonkers at this time period. So much so, this is one of my favorite quotes from Morrow Mayo in 1933, but to show again how pervasive all this stuff was. And it was any geomancer, soothsayer, holy jumper, herb doctor, whirling dervish, snake charmer, metacaster, table turner, evil eye, practicing any form of black magic, demonology, joint jerking, witchcraft, thaumaturgy, spirit rapping, back rubbing, physical torture, or dialectical novelty would find an audience. He was talking about what was going on in Chicago because Chicago was a hotbed of new religious movements. So one of them first is we have to talk about is the Azusa revival that happened in Los Angeles. So Charles Parham, a white man, and William Seymour, a black man. This is right after the Civil War during Reconstruction, went west and had this idea of what Pentecostalism is. And so if anybody's, familiar, I'm not going to define everything about Pentecostalism, but it is an offshoot of Protestant beliefs, and it has relations to many of the other offshoot Protestant beliefs like Methodism and Baptist beliefs. And so the idea was like God is speaking to us but in very specific ways. So this notion of speaking in tongues, that God gives you the gifts, the herky-jerky, uncontrollable movements, and it's called the Azusa Revival, and it starts spreading throughout the country. And what people take from it and what other preachers take from it is how dynamic and how revolutionary this notion is of healing, of recruiting people to be essentially a part of the service, breaking down this wall between God and the person, is that you don't need the intermediary anymore. You can talk to God directly, and God is going to talk to you. And so we look at this at the same time as Amy Semple McPherson, and a lot of, notice that's a dining hall. So that's the other note, is it comes back to our tribalism and our sharing food. Economic times in the late 1800s to the early 1900s was not great. There was, we think about the Great Depression of the 1930s, but before that, there was the Great Depression of 1893, 1897. It was not a stable economic time, and nor were there any of the social safety nets that exist today, like Social Security, or like even food stamps, or supplemental food benefits for women and children. You were on your own. So the only people that had this notion of taking care of the poor were religious organizations. The more traditional old Protestant, saying Lutheran and Catholic, had mechanisms and kind of had a whole system in place for taking care of the poor. These new religious movements did the same thing. And one of the most critical things that anyone can do to someone who is poor is feed them, is give them food. And so Amy Semple McPherson, as well as many other of the groups we're going to meet, started by running food pantries and free lunches. And because when you have someone, you feed them, they've got to listen to the spiel. So the other things that are going on that are influencing, before we get to our Chicagoans and our modern food stuff, is we have to talk a little bit about the Germans and the naturemen. So the Germans had this great idea, this belief that man should be free from industrial pollution, and even if you're working in a factory, go outside. We need to have fresh air. You need to be naked in the sun, touch grass, as the kids say today. And this notion of what was perfect, ideal, was the Americas, the American West and the American plains. And that's all due to one man. That's the man standing in costume holding the rifle, which is Karl May, who was a novelist, a German novelist who wrote, um, I can't, thousands, literally thousands of books. He's still to this day the best-selling author of German language books forever. And what he wrote about were cowboy and Indian stories. So much so is that even our notions of what cowboy and Indian is informed by Karl May. And so we've got all these people coming to the America. They're coming to the United States, and they're bringing these ideas, and these ideas about religious belief, about food, and about how to live and how to be healthy. And our last of our woo merchants, and I will truly say these guys are woo merchants, that's Anna Blavatsky and Henry Oswald. And they are the ones who are credited. We're kind of introducing Eastern and Buddhist ideas to the United States in the 1800s. Alcott, truly, following as a Buddhist practitioner, and Blavatsky, who's the founder of Theosophy. And that is a little bit of a belief of self-manifestation. I hear all the kids talking about, I'm going to manifest it. Well, you're saying that because Madame Blavatsky told you to. She taught that, of if we can perfect ourselves, to be ourselves and tap into the higher spiritual planes, we can have control over every aspect of our lives and control the outcomes. Again, so now we have sanitariums and buildings, and everybody is building this. Loma Linda Sanitarium, that's the Seventh-day Adventists. Again, very health-oriented. They started building their sanitariums in Michigan, right in Battle Creek and right outside of Chicago, because that was the vacation land. And that was Dr. Kellogg, graham crackers. It's important to talk about the SDA for a moment, because one of their beliefs, which is one of the core beliefs, is that your body is a temple. We've all heard that. But they take it a little further, as do many other groups, is that that temple, that body doesn't really belong to you. It belongs to God. And so it is your human responsibility to take care of it because it really doesn't belong to you. And you take care of it by being healthy and eating the kind of foods prescribed by the SDA, which does happen to have a very healthy vegan, almost vegan diet, plant-based. They also believe in not a lot of flavor, and because food can also excite the sexual urges, and you don't want that. Hence the graham crackers and things that are very bland. We need bland systems to keep people very calm. Um, and so these are like where we're getting now. We're getting into like the really late 1800s, and you guys watching may recognize now some of these folks. Okay, Dr. O.Z. Hanisch, that's Otto Hanisch. And it was more of a German spelling. He was born in Milwaukee and moved as a child to Chicago. And he set up his very new religious movement called Mazdaznan in Chicago right at the early 1900s. And Mazdaznan was essentially a proto pseudo Zoroastrian belief, like Zarathustra, which so it's almost Manichean in the sense that it has like good, evil, those two gods are actual beings and they're represented. But Dr. Hanisch's, I use doctor with the quotes, his belief in really in manifesting that system was by controlling what we eat, not just controlling when, but the what and the where and how. And so their food systems, and they publish cookbooks, was very prescriptive. Like you could only eat light foods, i.e., foods that see the light during certain times of year. You could only eat dark foods, i.e., carrots, things that grow in the dirt under the dark during certain times of year. And so he was actually brought to court in Chicago many times, named as usually in divorce suits because they would recruit women. Women were more prone to fall under Dr. Hanisch's spell. They'd institute all these drastic food changes, and their husbands would rebel and often then sue for divorce because they didn't want to eat that way. Um, on the more negative side is that the city of Chicago also sued Dr. Hanisch because for child neglect. Because following this program of eating, especially as a child, is not good, and children were being malnourished. So again, we can look at the fun side of some of these things, but there is often a dark side. The other guy on the other end wagging his finger at you is J. Alexander Christ Dowie, who is the founder of Zion, Illinois. Anybody from Zion watching? Your town was founded by a religious leader who God spoke to him, and he said, make your own town. And he was very strict. No smoking, no drinking, very little sex. And it was about living as pure and clean as possible. And of course, there was some financial chicanery eventually. But you can still see Dowie's house and some of the old original buildings if you go to downtown Zion, and there is a great historical society you can see there. In the top is W.D. Fard, is his most common name. Um, Born in what we think is Detroit and came to Chicago. Below him is a man by many names. That is Noble Drew Ali, again, another Chicagoan. Noble Drew Ali founded the Moorish Temple, and around the same time, W.D. Fard, Wallace Farad, founded the Nation of Islam. Neither of the Moorish or the Islamic group actually had any real experience of Islam. And so they were definitely new religious movements, but they also had started adopting a lot of food systems and food practices. Um, we look at this too, and this is a picture of Matthew Wentworth in New York to say, here's our leaders at the time. I mentioned earlier about the lost tribes of Israel. Well, it was here in the United States, and a lot of groups were believing it. And so there was a number of Black religious leaders saying, well, if we read this correctly, I think us, we're the real lost Jews. And you'll see this is it broke in two ways. There are still today modern groups that are essentially Black Israelites. And that is a very odd, niche, new religious movement. But then there were also groups like Matthew Ford's, who said, no, actually, we're really Jews, and we're actually embraced by the traditional Judaic community in New York, and we're accepted as members of the Judaic community. A lot of the idea about the lost tribes being Black people comes from something that was considered a crazy idea that got proven right, which is in Ethiopia. There were a group of people that were like, we're Jewish. We're actually Jewish people. And it had been denied for a long time. But with the advent of DNA testing, they were actually say, yeah, 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 these are Jewish people. And so many of them actually have immigrated back to Israel. Um, so these ideas are just simmering, and this is where we get to how this becomes modern and how it affects all of our food systems. So this is, of course, a picture from the south side of Chicago of the Moorish Science Temple. The Moorish Science Temple, they had a pretty strict protocol on behavior. No drinking, no smoking, and again, no pork, because they were following kind of a halal diet. But like later the Nation of Islam, they were considered so reliable is that they were then working for the Chicago Daily Machine as truck drivers. And to this day, groups from the Moorish Science, as well as through the Nation of Islam, there's a lot of trucking industry that goes on, and cooperation. My favorite modern convergence on this is the Nation of Islam truck drivers. There's an association have partnered with what is the Unification Church, most commonly known as Moonies. So the Unification Church supplies 90% of all of the fish used for sushi in the United States. They control the sushi market. Because that can be very expensive and lucrative, they have a partnership with the Nation of Islam to transport all of that very expensive sushi fish around the country. Again, so this is the part of the influences, where these hidden influences from these religious beliefs and practices, how it's influenced American food. Um, Another aspect of it that goes back to the idea of pre-safety nets is this is a man wearing this homemade Father Divine in the again early 1900s. Father Divine was a Black minister who came originally from Georgia, from the South. It's a little unknown what his actual bio is, and his belief system was quite simple, which was um, peace, love each other, be peaceful all the time. Um, there is critique that he considered himself God, and in all of my research, it's a little nebulous. He was Father Divine. He would let people kind of question and worship him in that way, but it was never in a truly like worshipful. They looked to Father Divine for leadership, but never did they worship him as a god. I know I'm threading a fine needle here, but it makes sense because um, one of Father Divine's missions was the food. And he famously said, because your God would not feed the people, I came and am feeding them. Because your God kept such as you segregated and discriminated, I came and I am unifying all nations together. That is why I came, because I did not believe in your God. And so it's almost an agnostic-y belief system. But what it really was mutual aid. Father Divine, his communion service on Sundays was just a meal. Some of the big ones were outrageous. We're talking like 20-course meals, and people would just engorge themselves. And if Father Divine was there, he would be preaching during that. Otherwise, in places, because again, at his peak, he had millions of followers throughout the country. They would play recordings of his speeches, his homilies, whatever you want to call it, his pastoral message. But it was always centered around food. Something important to bring out at this time, look at how integrated this crowd is. In 1896, the Jim Crow laws were passed, but it took a while for white people to implement these kind of revision to white supremacist laws in the United States. And until we really got going in the 1920s and 30s, most churches were integrated. You did not see this racial separation that you still see to this day. And this is evidenced also by, you can see that Father Divine suppers, they're totally integrated. one of the things they did is in their fundraising, and of course they did fundraising, you could live communally. You could, if you didn't have to, but you could choose to give everything you owned to the peace mission, and then you get permanent residence in one of their apartment buildings and always a permanent job. Always, it was a safety. And they also encouraged their members to start businesses, to do something to help bring stability to the group as well as to their own families. And because they were so food oriented, many of the businesses they started were food, restaurants, grocery stores, bakeries, things like that, and even farms. So one of the people that followed that model was the Nation of Islam. Seeing this idea, especially as a reaction to white supremacy and that restriction and oppression, is to own all of their own food supply. And so you see this to this day with the Nation of Islam, is to own the farms, own the grocery stores, own the means of production. Because if you are able to control the food supply for your group, for your people, you have some stability. And this is a great picture of one of Father Divine's communion. This is a Sunday communion session outside. And this, I think this one was in New Jersey. And again, more pictures of Father Divine and the communions from all over the country, some even in Australia, all over the world. This was, and again, it was about peace and sharing meals. So there's an important thing. We're at like the, kind of coming up to the war period. And this is when it starts to get interesting because, as I said, the safety net, there wasn't any Social Security, there wasn't any welfare of any type. Um, the government also funded itself by collecting tariffs. There was no income tax or anything like that. Um, then in the 1913, we started getting this idea of income tax. Legislators pushed back to say, well, you can't make people pay taxes without giving them some sort of benefit. And that became the rise of the nonprofit entity, that churches, groups that were doing good should not have to pay taxes. They get a benefit, but they also have to, give that benefit. And then for the people, you would be able to subsidize a group doing good work with your money and then not have to pay taxes. You got a tax write-off. And that happens to this day. So if you are a church, and again, I'm using church to mean synagogue, temple, mosque, any religious group as a church, they must remain apolitical. They must disclose all of their financial information. They are not supposed to advocate for any type of political policy change. They have to reveal all their administrative costs. That's considered the disadvantages. But what we do know is that there's not a lot of enforcement on what these religious groups can do via the tax laws. So, but now we've got the First Amendment, we've got these tax laws that allow for religious organizations to earn money without having to pay taxes on it. And you've got all of this immigration story of people bringing their food cultures and their religious cultures and ideas to the United States. When World War II happens, all of the kind of religious movements, the social movements really were paused. People then unified to kind of take care of the business. But once World War II was over, all of these new religious movements really bounced back with a vengeance. And now we start to recognize names and people in different beliefs and groups that, modern folks may recognize these. When I talked about the German influence earlier, back to nature, and these were the nature mention. They all then came to California and would go and live in like a hollow in Palm Springs, the nature man. But they pretended to be hermits, but they had a lot of visitors for guys who were hermits. But famously, Willem Pester was one of the earliest ones, and they advocated for what's called a natural food diet, often a raw food diet, only plants, only, plant-based only, and a lot of times raw. Eden Abez, kind of famous because he wrote a song made famous by Cole Porter called Nature Boy. Gypsy Boots was one of the founders of the earliest health food grocery stores in California. and he was a protege of the William Richter, who immigrated from Chicago out to California to start his Nutrifon, Whole Foods, natural raw food restaurant and store. So these are people that also then integrated into the Los Angeles kind of community, which was pretty open-minded about different religious beliefs because of Azusa, because of Amy Semple McPherson, because of just the Seventh-day Adventists being out there. And so you may recognize Jack LaLanne. Jack LaLanne, who was one of the early Nature Boys and famously kind of a bodybuilder. And he meets this one fella named Jim Baker. Jim Baker is famous because he becomes Father Yod and is a great example of our food and cult intersection. Because before Jim Baker became Father Yod, Jim Baker was a nature guy, one of the Nature Boys, who then also owned restaurants. And his restaurant was the Source Family Restaurant. And here's a couple scenes. It was in Hollywood. And it was famous. You see a picture of Woody Allen there because they filmed a scene there. It became really popular. And what they were doing is they really introduced this idea of health food to Hollywood and to people. And so if Hollywood stars were eating there, which they were, then other people wanted to eat there. So they really started spreading. So it's the Source family that spread this notion of you can have this restaurant and you can spread your message via the restaurant. Oh, and by the way, if your restaurant is part of your religious mission and the people working there are your followers, they're on their religious mission service and you don't have to pay them. Now, anybody who's worked in the service industry and knows about running a restaurant knows that if you never had to pay your staff, um, you can make a profit. And so for Father Yod, for the Source family, really sent a modern template for a lot of these new religious movements to get into the food business because they could make it their mission. It helped recruit new believers, it helped earn them money, and they didn't have to pay taxes. That was a great idea. So Yogi Bhajan, also in LA, who also knew Father Yod, Jim Baker, Father Yod, took a couple yoga classes, was following Yogi Bhajan for a little bit and went like, oh, this is a good racket. I'm going to go off on my own, which happens a lot. Yogi Bhajan famously wasn't really, he knew yoga, but he really wanted to be rich. And that's really where it starts. So he started his group specifically to teach yoga and get rich. Um, and he had practices right away to vet people because often people will ask us, like, well, I would never join a cult. I would never do that. Well, there are people that would. And so a lot of these groups weed those people out with little pressure tests, like you have to eat garlic 3 times a day at morning, noon, and night for a week straight before you can come to join my yoga class. Well, if you're going to do that, then you're more susceptible to go along with everything else. If you're not, well, they don't want you anyways. Um, Yogi Bhajan then expanded and started with restaurants. They started opening restaurants throughout the West, the Southwest. Um, he started amassing political power, and that is, there he is, Yogi Bhajan with John Paul II, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. The guy with the hands is Neil Richardson, the former governor of New Mexico, who was kind of a negotiating diplomat for the United States. It's because Bhajan was after power and money. And these are all the food businesses started by Yogi Bhajan. Some of them are only available in the UK because, again, this was a worldwide operation. But everybody might remember, and you can still see them on the shelves, Kettle potato chips or Yogi tea. That's all owned by Yogi Bhajan and Yogi Bhajan's organization. Yogi Bhajan died a few years back, and his family and then the nonprofit church organization are still in the courts trying to unravel the multi-billion-dollar companies that religious group built. So it comes back to here's Father Divine again. I have a soft spot for Father Divine. This notion of just sharing food together influences how we're going to look at each other and our religious beliefs. And this is where it can always go wrong. Now, in the book I wrote, which you could read, if you wish, you can get it from the library. It has examples of recipes from many of these groups, and it has a lot more information about groups that I've not even mentioned here. This is just kind of a highlight. And some of you folks may recognize this picture of who it is, because it's one of the questions I get most about what about Jonestown? What about Jonestown? That's Jim Jones. And Jim Jones, again, followed that playbook of essentially coming from outside of Indianapolis in a Pentecostal tradition and had a very diverse integrated church. And he'd been burned out by the KKK in the 50s and immigrated west with his congregation. Started along the lines with that many groups do of doing service, opening up food soup kitchens and feeding people, and increasingly became more paranoid and more coercive in their control. There are some divergence on like the stories a little bit. There are some people that were affiliated with the People's Temple, obviously not at Jonestown, but in the Bay Area, that have very good, solid memories of being a part of the People's Temple because it was a very socialist and socially organized group. The idea of Jonestown was to be an agricultural commune to, grow food for all of its believers around the world. And this is a picture not of Jonestown, but of like one of their like just picnic cookouts that they had. They had regular open house cookouts when they were up in the San Francisco Bay Area, up in the Mendocino County. And then this is a picture of everybody, communally working in Jonestown in the kitchens at Jonestown. It was truly supposed to be a utopia. It was not a utopia. Obviously, we know how this ends. Is Jones increasingly grew paranoid through drug use. There is some legitimate documentation that the FBI was investigating him on money because here's the thing with communes, any communal, usually it's about sharing everything together. So you give over what you own and then everybody shares everything. Um, in the hands of the wrong person, that means a large amount of wealth amassed under the control of one or just a few people. And that's where Jonestown kind of that direction went. Under pressure, Jones started becoming more and more paranoid that the US government was going to invade and take over Jonestown. And so they decided they meaning Jones and his, inner council, decided that it would be better to die than do that. The terribleness thing, it's one thing for a group to make a decision on its own, but this is where the coercive and the really danger part is that over 900 people died at Jonestown, and many of them children who had no choice in the matter. And so I'd leave it a little bit on this dark note, but not entirely, because we have to think about what is God telling us? And can God tell us what to eat? He can tell you what to eat, but he can't tell me what to eat. And I think, and that's one of the things that we can lose sometimes in the dangers in the cultic beliefs versus just a communal belief. And this is the kind of at the same time as Jonestown, as the same time in maybe 10 miles away from Jones's original areas in Mendocino County was Norman Paulson and the Brotherhood of the Sun, the Sunburst family. They believed in a little bit of everything. They were very benign. They did, their space brothers were going to come. They could talk to spirits. They were kind of hippies. They had a great bakery. They obviously had a cookbook. Paulson on his own went a little nuts, but he also went nuts on his own. He did take some money and then kind of went on the proverbial drinking, drugs, and sex binge for a few years. But, after he died, his wife Patty, who's still alive, still runs the group as a yoga retreat, as a wellness center. And so again, nothing that bad happened to them. Here's another guy, the Adi Da. He is one of my favorite names, Adi Da. Bubba Free John, that's a great name. And again, fairly benign. He owned a lot of property. He died a few years ago, but he he was one of the practitioners of breatharianism and believed that if you could just work yourself up to such a holy state that you could forego food altogether and be even holier. Pro tip, don't do that. We all need to eat food, so don't do that. Um, this one, again, a little darker. They wrote a cookbook too. You may not recognize what this group is. The Transfiguration Diet was published in 1982, and Little Green evolved to be Heaven's Gate. And so, again, the people involved in Heaven's Gate, adults who all chose their end. Um, there's always a lot of talk about coercive control, but we have to think about if people are choosing, making bad choices and following bad logic, its logical, illogical end, that is usually the groups that will get a bad outcome. A modern group that, again, worldwide, that's really interesting to me is the Loving Hut. If anybody's been on the West Coast, they're not in the Midwest yet, but it's a Loving Hut vegan cuisine. It's kind of a pan-Asian with a very Thai focus. It's great. The food is delicious. And the woman you see on the sign, it's Madame Hai. Again, her belief system is kind of Buddhisty, but very distilled, where she just believes that everyone should chant for world peace. If you just chant for a specified amount of time per day, it will help bring peace to the planet. And obviously believes in veganism because that also will help the planet. Doesn't ask for your money, will sell you a few trinkets on her website, and you can go to the restaurants. And that's really about it. So the spectrum of all these new religious movements are, from very awful, coercive, terrible to very benign, are still active here in the United States. Um, and most of them have this, again, outsized effect on the food. If anybody's buying tofurkey, if you bought a tofurkey, that is because the commune at the farm in Middle Tennessee, which was grown out of a drug church, it was literally, they were, taking massive amounts of LSD in the hopes of transcending the spirit and seeing God. From there, they kind of got more and more mellowed out, moved to Tennessee, and were always vegetarian, mostly vegan, and on the self-sufficiency decided to start, making these businesses because they needed to feed themselves and they could feed other people. Morningstar brand. If anybody's had Morningstar brand fake meats, that is a business that was started by the Seventh-day Adventists. If anybody's had Celestial Seasonings tea, they too are a new religious movement a little out there. Now, I do differentiate between the groups that used kind of food and influenced their food culture versus religious people or religious groups in the restaurant. So people ask about, like, well, what about the Cheesecake Factory? Or what about like In-N-Out Burger? Those are just the kind of businesses who happen to be run by religious devotees versus something that is religiously focused. So there's a little bit of a difference. The picture you see here is, again, as Midwesterners, is one of the place I could never get in, that it's the only place that threatened me with violence during my research tour. And it's outside of Shawano, Wisconsin. And it's the Romp the Ray. And it shows that progression of, it started as in the mid 70s as a very benign Hindu kind of group, mostly white people led by an Indian American. They have gone since then to become super fundamentalist Christian, and very anti-Catholic. And they also represent one of the challenges and fears of people in governments with large religious groups living communally, which is you still have the right to vote. And so a group of people who are all following one religious leader or ideal can definitely shift local politics, especially in a small town like Shawano, Wisconsin. And Shawano faced that, where the mayor was threatened with death. And it got pretty hairy over there because they would have taken over the town and made the town. That is not a new thing. Why the Mormons were driven out there westward was mostly because there were enough of them, they could take over the city government of any local town that they went to. It was the fear of the Rajanishis in Oregon when they were taking over, because they were legitimately saying, we're bringing this amount of people, we will now take over the government. And then they can, make the government work for them. That's always the fear of these new religious movements. And does it happen all the time? It doesn't, but it can. And this is where that fear comes from. There's also misplaced fear, especially with groups that are brand new. The beliefs aren't familiar. The people don't look like us. And again, going back to where I'm from in Milwaukee, in August in 2012, a white supremacist, a Nazi for Latin, for there's no beating around the bush. He was a Nazi. Went to the Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin during their Langer, the Sikh tradition of after their service of offering a free meal to everyone. It's open to everyone who wants to come. You all are welcome to eat and share a meal with them. He came in and he opened fire and killed 7 people, and this um, ruined this congregation, ruined so many families. This particular picture is of the Oak Creek Sikh Temple, the women making langar exactly a year later. You can go to the Sikh temple today, and after services at Langer, you are welcome. You do have to go through a metal detector now, but you are still welcome to share their meal, because the sharing of food ultimately is how we become human. And in America, it's how we become American, by eating all of these different foods imbued with ritual meaning and made with honest love. Because even if you disagree or you find the belief system of someone morally just absolutely repugnant, they're not really trying to poison you. If they're trying to share their message with their meal, it's because they think you're worthy of it. Um, can it still be annoying? Of course it is. But the food might be really tasty. So consider opening your mind to a few of these religious ideas and religious groups and religious food, and try them out. Again, if you check out Holy Food from the library, it's filled with recipes that you can try on your own. And so I'm going to stop here. And if we've got any questions, I'm going to take them. I always like to show this picture. This picture, as we leave for questions, is from the temple, that copy of the temple cookbook by Yogi Bhajan. I bought mine secondhand. That stack of books was during my research phase for recipes. And when I was looking up recipes, lo and behold, yes, I found a marijuana leaf embedded in the pages of the cookbook, which is, to my mind, peak hippie 70s, and really kind of a nice indicative coda to the whole research project. And we'll leave you there if people want to look. Any questions? I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, Christina, that was amazing.
Oh, good.
I'm gonna have so much fun texting some friends later about their favorite chips. Okay, we do have a couple questions. One from AC is, do you have a podcast, or is there a place where we can hear more from you?
Um, part of my day job is I run a small independent publishing company, and we're actually just launching it. I won't be talking about food as much, but we'll be talking to different authors. I'm happy. I've been on a few podcasts talking to Chris Kimball on Milk Street Radio on good food. And I think if you Google Holy Food in my name and a few, you can hear me talk about the food, but no podcast. But you know, who knows? Maybe I'll get myself another job
Yeah, you should do that. You've got a great
in
voice
addition
for
to.
it. I'm gonna put the link to Feral House here so that folks can check that out, and then maybe we can talk about that in a moment too. But I've got a question here from L. You mentioned a story about Little Debbie's that you bring up every
Yes.
time someone buys one. What is that story?
So, like the Morningstar brand of food, is Little Debbie's were started by the Seventh-day Adventists. The Seventh-day Adventists, and what I mean by that, there are a few companies owned by the church itself. The Worthington brand, if you're in a co-op health food stores, that's where you'll see their canned foods, a lot of like meat substitutes. But like the Peace Mission, the Seventh-day Adventist encourages their followers to start businesses that are mission aligned, that help um, recruit either believers or share the message. And so a baker was funded. So, and that's the SDA will give loans for, and you have to go before the SDA council and they'll give you a loan to start your food business, especially if it meets their criteria. He was one of the first. He had his little oatmeal cookie sandwiches that were didn't use sugar, they used honey, they used all these substitutes that so aligned to what the SDA food rules were. And that was the start of the Little Debbie company. If you are old enough, like I am, and ate Little Debbie snack cakes um, in the 70s, you would have been eating carob. That was the great myth, is that chocolate was considered a stimulant. And so as the Little Debbie snack cakes kind of grew to expand to different styles, is they used carob instead of chocolate. And many of us are still scarred to this day. The good news for anybody eating Little Debbie's today is that that company was sold off about 20 years ago. And yes, it's chocolate. It's not great quality chocolate, but it is chocolate. It's no longer carob. So that's the origin story of Little Debbie. So for every Star Crunch, you can thank the SDA and William Miller that the world did not end in 1844 or 43.
Thank God for that.
Yeah,
Please put more questions in the chat. Yeah, I just, so my son actually told me about the celestial seasonings thing. He's a big YouTube conspiracy kind of, kid. But he mentioned something about the fish sandwich at McDonald's. Is there any connection with that and Catholicism or anything like that?
absolutely.
Oh, really?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
No way.
And this is how the influence of the food culture, and we're just coming out of the Easter season. So what are the great Catholic industrial cities? It's Milwaukee, Chicago, Cleveland, and Buffalo. Very Catholic on the Great Lakes. And the lake part is important because there is the old Catholic prohibition about eating meat on Lenten Fridays. It used to be any Friday, and then no meat during Lent. And so over time, the rules have changed a bit. But there was a fella in Buffalo who owned a McDonald's franchise, and he noticed on Fridays, and then especially in Lent, that his sales on hamburgers were just in the toilet. And he thought, what would get people back in? And that's why he invented the fish sandwich based on the tradition of doing fish fries and, pulling perch out of the lake. And yeah, he started that at his McDonald's. He then let McDonald's corporate know that this is a really good idea. This is taking off. They analyzed it and they were like, "Oh yeah." So in the first few years of the filet o fish, it was just offered during like kind of Lenten season, and then it became so popular, it was added to the menu year round. So if you enjoy a McDonald's filet o fish sandwich, thank the Catholics.
Good to know. Good to know. Um, yeah, I do want to let everyone know that this book is incredible. We have it here at the library. One of my favorite sections is the part at the end with all the recipes. Do you have a favorite recipe back there? Or do you want to tell us about some of them, Christina?
Oh, I have some favorite ones. Is one of my favorites is the Chicago Otto Hanesh, the Mazdaznan. They have something called dough gods. And they, if you're feeling sick, eat a dough god. You're feeling down, eat a dough god. And then when you look at what a dough god is, it's kind of fry bread. It's really fry bread. And anybody who's had fry bread knows that's pretty good. So that's one of those. One of the ones that surprisingly really tastes good, because that's always a thing in the recipes of the book. It'd be easy to like give examples of like just really terrible tasting things and kind of point the finger and go, "Oh, look at that weird thing they ate." We tested we meaning myself and a bunch of friends during the pandemic, we tested recipes. And so all of the recipes included past muster so that they were all palatable. So one of my favorites is the apple corn cookie. It sounds odd, but it is gluten free. It's cornmeal and applesauce. It's super healthy and it's really tasty. I have a sweet tooth, so my first instinct is always to think about desserts. But another one that turns out really well, I can't say the name officially, but there is Ron's expletive beans from a radical commune in New York. And those are, if you're looking for a really good, tasty baked bean recipe, solid. Those beans are solid. Highly recommend.
Yeah, that's the fun thing about this book is not only all the history, which blows me away. I mean, honestly, this stuff about Yogi Bhajan is incredible, and just how far back it goes. But yeah, no, just to be able to have these recipes that you can like pull out and talk about over a cocktail or something, or serve somebody the Heaven's Gate vinaigrette and see what they think, that sort of thing.
Exactly. We did one. I recently went to with. I was invited to do like holy food, a cult food dinner, and one of the recipes that they had made, which is the old House of David from Michigan. They were in Benton Harbor, St. Joe, Michigan. The House of David. It was they called a rink dum ditty, and it's essentially a variation on a Welsh rarebit. And everybody was blown away at how delicious it was. They were saying we might put this on the menu regularly because it was so good. So even if a recipe name sounds odd or the group sounds like just wackadoos, the food could be pretty good. So try it.
That's great. That's great. It looks like we're all out of questions unless any folks want to
Okay.
enter some in last minute. But Christina, I just want to say thank you so much. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Feral House? I put the link in there, and
Sure. Feral House is a nearly 40-year-old publisher of nonfiction, independent. And so that means we're not part of like the big New York publishing machine. Independent, but we're not a nonprofit either. So we live by selling books. And the books we make and sell are, I describe often as a couple different focus areas: counterculture, music, um, high weirdness is always a good blanket term. So if you kind of like what we're talking about today, then you'll probably like some of the other books that we publish. We've just started been doing more in food books and cookbooks and started, so that's like a new kind of channel that we've been exploring. Um, but everything from Lords of Chaos, which was kind of an infamous book about Norwegian death metal, to bubblegum music will save your life, to um, one that again, it may seem like a conspiracy book, but the recent opening of the CIA files has proven it true, which is it- it's called A Lie Too Big to Fail. The paperback's coming out this summer, so it'll be available for the libraries to get. It is on the analysis of the RFK assassination of all things. It really, the Lisa who Pease, the researcher who wrote it, again, not not everything is a conspiracy. Sometimes it really is, it went down bad and we were told a lie. And in this case, the story that we think we know about RFK and Sirhan Sirhan is definitely not the real story. So there's an example of some of the Feral House books that we publish, that might be of interest to folks going to the library.
absolutely. Yeah, definitely check that site out, and definitely check out the library. We have those on the shelf. So I do want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Christina, this was the one program I've been looking forward to for months. It was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me, and I hope everyone enjoyed listening to me go on for a while. And the weather seems to pass. Let's be grateful that hopefully no damage wherever you're listening in.
I don't have windows in this room, but no one had to come in and take shelter from the tornado watch. So I think we're good to go. And I'm looking forward to, some clear skies. That'd be nice.
All right, everybody, be well and think about what you're eating.
Yes. Have a great night. Christina, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And we'll see you down the road. Have a good one.